Hello everyone, in this video I wanted to do a quick experimentation with using only 3 tubes of watercolour paint and mixing various secondary colours from them. These weren't necessarily pure primary colours, but I still managed to get a good effect. I started off with taping down my paper to prevent buckling, and I'm just using the painter's masking tape here and then in the middle normal masking tape to separate the two sides. And I'm using a circular palette to mix in. I'm using Winsor Newton Cotman paints, which are a student grade. I wanted to experiment with them and see what they were like, and I will talk about my thoughts on them later. I have 3 colours: permanent rose, Gamboge hue and turquoise. These aren't ideal for pure colour mixing, but I also wanted to see what colours I could get with just these 3. I used a syringe with some clean water to drop in varying amounts of water to mix with, and 2 jars of water. You need 2 jars of water so that you can have one for washing off your brushes and one for picking up the clean water. And the brushes that I'm using here are by Artist Hills, and I'll leave a comment with I'll leave a link in the description for you. I start off by mixing some of the paint with water so that I can make a wash. The more water that you add, the lighter the paint will be. And so I put in some water with the syringe, which has clean water in it, into the wells of my circular palette so that I can create more than one shade and do some colour mixing as well. So I'm just mixing up some water with the 3 primaries, and make sure that you really wash your brush in between this, otherwise you'll end up with mud. And I wanted to make a fairly pale wash in the background of these 2 little pictures. So I'm going to do one with warm tones and one with cool tones. And I also mixed in a green in the middle using a variation of a mix of the yellow and the blue, just so that I would have a green as well. So those 2 jars of water, if you try and keep them separate, then you'll always have one jar that has clean water in it, that you can pick up every time you need clean water on your brush for picking up a new colour. It's also quite handy to have a paper towel with you, so that if you have got some paint on your brush, you could wipe it off first before rinsing your brush off, so that not so much paint is going into the water and muddying up your water too quickly. So you can see that I just took a small amount of paint to begin with, so I've got a fairly pale tone of colour in these mixes. And I'm using a large flat brush to create a wash. So first of all, I wet my paper, and then while the paper is still wet, and you don't want to have too much water on your paper so that you'll get puddles, but a fair amount of water, I'm just doing a flat wash fairly quickly with the red and the yellow on one side and the blue and the yellow on the other. And you'll see that as those 2 colours meet in the middle, there's an element of colour mixing. So the red and the yellow become orange, which is the secondary colour that you get if you mix red and yellow, and the blue and the yellow is going to mix into a green. Now that yellow went on fairly intensely, too intensely for what I was wanting, so I just took off some of the colour with a paper towel just to lighten it up a bit. You really want to make sure that these layers are completely dry before you move on to the next step, because if you try and paint into these at the moment, the colours will bleed. So unless that is the look you're going for, if you want to do glazing on top, then you need to let this layer dry before you move on to painting on top of it. And that is one key element with watercolor paint. is, you know, whether you decide to paint wet into wet or wet onto dry. And then if you have two colours next to each other that you don't want them to bleed, make sure that one of those layers is dry before you move on to the next one. So now I'm mixing in a little more paint into my water to intensify the colour, and I'm also mixing up an orange by mixing the yellow and the red together. So you could vary this by how much of each colour you add, so that in theory you could make many different variations on that orange. You can make a yellowish orange or a reddish orange, and so on and so forth. And I'm using my largest round brush. It's not too big, it's kind of a medium size to paint my leaves. These brushes are perfect for getting that shape because the tip of the brush is nice and fine, and so I can get that pointy end, but then if I press down on my brush I can get a much wider line. And because the paint below is dry, I'm getting a glaze on top of a slightly deeper red, which then sits on top of the previous colour that I put in. You can drop in some other colours into this and you'll get some interesting effects if your paint is still wet. And I actually use another brush, a smaller one, to drop in the other colours so that I don't have to keep washing off my brush, because if I put my clean brush into the yellow and I had some red on it, it would gradually change that colour over time. So the aim is to really try and keep your colours fairly separate and not mix them too much in the palette. When you drop those colours in, you can get some really nice effects depending on how wet your paper and your paint is when you drop it in. So you'll see here in this video that if I drop it into really wet paint that I've just laid down, it kind of makes lovely splodgy effects. But if I put it on paint that has already dried a little bit, it's a completely different effect altogether. I'm painting my leaves intuitively. I didn't draw them out with pencil first, but you could of course do that if you wish. I decided that I was just going to go for it and see what happened. Make sure though that the leaves do not touch each other at this point, because the paint on these leaves is still wet, and otherwise you would lose the definition of the shape of the leaves. Because they would start to bleed into each other. So here I'm painting some using the yellow, and because I'd intensified that yellow by adding some more of the paint, some more pigment, then this yellow is darker than the yellow behind it, so it's creating a glaze on top of a darker yellow. And you could even do this even more by having another well of yellow with less water and more paint. But you don't really want to be using these paints from the tubes straight as. You do need to mix them with water. They're designed to do that. So here's my orange, and again you can see I'm going to drop in some colours and create some interesting little effects, mottled effects on the leaves by dropping in some other colours here. So I drop in some red into these leaves. So I'm going to let this side dry because I want to paint some more leaves on it, but I want these leaves to dry before I do that. So usually when I'm working on watercolour, sometimes I'll work on more than one piece at a time so that I don't have to wait for each layer to dry before I move on to the next one. I can work on one painting and then while it's drying work on another one. Alternatively, you could dry your layers with a hot air dryer, or but make sure that that doesn't blow your pigment around. So I've moved on to my cool side, and you can see I've got my blue and my yellow, and I'm going to mix up various different greens with it. Now some of this video got lost. I don't quite know what happened, but you can see that. I did the same kind of thing by painting leaves on this side with the different kinds of tones. So to make a very greenishy, yellowishy green, mix more yellow with your blue, and then likewise to make more like an aqua blue, mix just a small amount of yellow with blue, and then that's how you'll get the different kinds of green tones. So there are two different ways that you can change the color of these paints. So from just 3 tubes of paints, you can get many, many different colors and tones by either mixing different paints in different degrees to get different kinds of shades, or how much water you decide to add so that you can make lighter or darker tones of that color. At this point, I could mention my thoughts on the Winsor & Newton Cotman paints. I don't think I'd use these paints for finish pieces that I wanted to sell or frame up, because I can tell that they're not as good as the professional paints, but they're really great for trying things out, and they're really reasonable cost. I think these tubes were about £4.50 for 21 mils. So in the professional range of Winsor & Newton, for the same price or even slightly more, you'll only get 5 mils. So they're much cheaper than professional paints, but are, I would say, the in-between cheap student paints and professional ranges. The colours are lovely and bright, and they mix well and they apply well, and they have quite good glazing properties. But the downside is that I can definitely tell that there's more filler in these paints, because the squirts of paint that I put into these palettes didn't last as long as my professional paints would. I've put tiny amounts of my professional paints into my palette, and they have lasted for several paintings, whereas these kind of went through in just 1 or 2 paintings. So I'm not sure really how much more cost effective they are, because even though you get bigger tubes, you go through those tubes a lot quicker than you would with the smaller tubes. And like I said, I can tell that there are more fillers in the tubes, but in terms of color intensity and vibrancy, and I think permanence as well, these are light fast, these paints, I would say that they're pretty good. I don't really have any complaints about them. And if you wanted to try out watercolor painting and you can afford a lot, then just getting these 3 tubes, you can see that you can actually make lots of different colors and I even went further in the experiment I made before I did this painting and made some different brown tones as well. So I mixed up a purple here, and I started painting these leaves to sit behind the ones that were in front, just to create a bit of depth, just to show you that you could take this even further if you want, and you could make like a forest almost by making more layers of leaves in deeper tones by intensifying the color. So that's just about it from me, and if you really like this video, I would love it if you would subscribe to me, as I plan on making some more watercolor tutorials, as well as my normal gel printing series that I have been working on. And you can find online classes from me at lucy'sartlab.com. I have a series of online classes there, and also there is a Facebook group for my students that if you search for Lucy's Art Lab on Facebook. And I will leave my other social media links in the description below. And I would love to hear in the comments what other kinds of watercolor videos you would like to see from me, so that I can help, it can help me decide what I'm going to start on next. Finally, you can just see me here removing my masking tape, and this one came off fairly easily. But if you ever have problems removing masking tape, you can put a heat gun onto it and that makes the tape come off super easy and won't tear your paper. But you get such a lovely, nice, sharp, clean edge by putting masking tape down. So thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.